Good morning. It is Tuesday, October 12th, 2004, and it is my great pleasure to be interviewing Mr. Alfred Altman. My name is Nancy Weiss-McQuide, and while I have connections with lots of people in the community, as I'm sure you do too, I have not had the pleasure.
Nor has it been my pleasure.
Thank you.
I
So,
haven't met previously.
we'll get to know each other.
Absolutely will.
All right, thank you for, sharing with us. Let's see here. Your full name?
My name is Alfred Altman. I sometimes use the middle initial H.
For handsome?
Oh, for Harry.
How long have you lived in Milwaukee?
I was born in Milwaukee. I turned 70 on July 30th of this year. And
It's hard to believe.
thank you very much. That's kind. Born, bred, and grew up on basically the west side of Milwaukee.
And what are your memories of your childhood?
Oh, gosh.
I know that's a big question.
I have a lot of
grade
memories
school-
of my
what
childhood.
grade school did you attend?
I went to Highmount Boulevard School from kindergarten until the 5th grade. So that would have been through the Second World War until the end of the Second World War.
I'm going to back up 1 minute if I
Uh-huh.
may. Your parents came from?
Well, my parents came from a number of places. My father's family came from, and pardon me for looking at some research information, but I spent some time doing some research just the last couple days. My father was born January 1st, 1850, and strangely, that's not true. I'm sorry, that was my father's father. My grandfather was born in 1850. His name was David Altman, and his wife was Fanny. She was born March 17th, 1845. They immigrated to the United.
Where were they?
They were born in Klecz, K-L-E-C-Z-W, Poland. Not being of knowing Polish, I'm not sure exactly how one pronounces that. They immigrated to the United States in 1870. Came to New York. At the time, they had no children, and went from New York in 1873 to Omaha, Nebraska.
Why Omaha?
Good question. I really don't know why they went to Omaha. However, they had 4 children in Omaha. And interestingly enough, I had an aunt who passed away a number of years ago who related to me that when she was a child in Omaha, and this was at the time just when the railroad was coming through, that her father ran today they'd call it a haberdashery store. However, at the time, she called it a trading post. And she remembers that Grandpa used to tell her, if you're not a good girl, I'm going to give you to the Indians. So, which is a kind of an interesting anecdote.
I think so. That was quite a threat back then.
That's right,
It's
that's
not-
right.
it's not
Because at the time, Omaha was just developing into a city. In fact, that was prior to the last of the Indian Wars in that area.
Wow.
They were in Omaha for 25 years. And in 1897, with their 4 children, which included my father, they moved to Milwaukee.
And what drew them to Milwaukee?
Why did they come to Milwaukee? Because my grandmother's brother lived in Milwaukee and was a very, very successful merchant. And his name was Lehman Ahrens, A-H-R-E-N-S. Extremely successful in the clothing business. So he told his sister to bring her family to Milwaukee where he would help establish them in the clothing business. They came to Milwaukee, as I say, and opened one of the first clothing stores on Upper 3rd Street. This was had a store in the early 1900s on Upper 3rd Street. Then my father joined his father in the clothing business and also had a tailor supply business at that time.
Do you know the name of the stores?
No, I don't, but I assume it was Altman's.
Probably.
A little history on my grandmother's side of the family of my father, because the Aarons family was one of the, how shall I put it, very well-to-do families in Milwaukee at the time. And he was one of the founders of Temple Emmanuel.
Oh, my.
He was very active in the Zionist movement. And that was, again, in the early 1900s. His son became one of the first Jewish judges in Milwaukee. And
What was his name?
the son's name was, and I have that. Let me see.
Sure, when you find it.
I got a lot of information. Charles Aarons.
Wow.
Charles Aarons.
That rings a bell. Quite an honor to the family.
Yes, yes. My father, as I say, followed his father in the clothing business. And another interesting anecdote, my father was considerably older than my mother when they were married. I think he was 17 years older than my mother.
Which was not uncommon.
Not at that time, evidently. And he was on the boat going over to France in the First World War when armistice was declared. And he was active in what they called the horse cavalry here in Milwaukee. And I have some pictures of him on his horse.
What, pardon my ignorance, but the horse cavalry served to,
Well, they were,
like police?
that was prior to armored First World War. They still used cavalry.
I see.
And,
So a soldier?
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely.
Wow,
Absolutely.
On
Yeah.
horseback. Mhm.
Yeah.
You have some pictures?
I have a few.
Ooh, what
I
treasures.
have a few,
what treasures.
yeah.
What was your father's name?
My father's name was Harry. Harry D., but actually they called him Harry, but his given name was Aaron. Aaron Harry, and somehow or other he reversed the names.
And your mother's name, please?
My mother's name was Margaret. Just a little family history. My father passed away when I was 3, 1938.
Oh, my.
Being in the tailor supply business, not uncommon to get stuck with a pin or whatever else. He stuck his thumb with a price tag of some kind and developed, at the time they called it septicemia or blood poisoning. Went to Deaconess Hospital, walked in, and they didn't have antibiotics at the time. They didn't develop
Penicillin.
antibiotics till early in the Second World War. They had no penicillin. Today you get a shot of penicillin and go about your normal business.
Sure, but not then.
Well, what they did then was they cut and they bled. And unfortunately,
Oh,
they
no.
didn't have anything that could help him, and the blood poisoning spread throughout the body, and he passed away, I think, a week after going into the hospital. And what they used to do, because I have uncles and cousins who were older at the time who actually gave him blood transfusions arm to arm.
Oh, my.
That's the way they used to do that then.
First of all, I'm sorry for your
But-
loss at such a young age. How many brothers and sisters did you have at that time?
I have one brother.
Older, younger?
He's 7 years older than I am.
So
right.
he was.
He remembers our father. I personally don't. I was too young to.
And your mother, so she
My
she was
my mother remained a widow all of her life.
Really?
So she was a very young widow.
And And she raised two
and
boys.
she went to work in order to provide for our family. That was 1938 was a very bad year. I lost my father and my grandfather, and my grandmother then came to live with us. I had an uncle who also lived with us.
Wow, those were the days with extended family
That's correct.
when you really hung together.
And we lived together until my uncle married. He was a piece goods buyer at Schuster's. Schuster's is a long gone name on 3rd Street here in Milwaukee. It was a department store like the Boston store.
Then they merged with Gimbel's, did they not? Gimbel's Schuster's or something?
No, Schuster's went out. Schuster's closed. They had 2 stores, one on 12th and one on 3rd. 3rd Street was a major shopping area of the city of Milwaukee.
Right.
You had a lot of fancy women's apparel shops like
It was the place to shop, was it
Bitker
not?
Gerners yeah, it was the second to the Wisconsin Avenue shopping.
And was that primarily a Jewish-run neighborhood? Or was
No. A lot of the merchants were Jewish. A lot of
Merchants.
the merchants were Jewish, yes.
Okay. And so that's where your store, well, after your father died?
My father passed away, and we lived on Highmont Boulevard till right after the war. I attended Highmont Boulevard School till the 5th grade. Went to the original Bethel Synagogue on 48th and Garfield, which was 2 blocks from my house. And one of the small little synagogue, Rabbi Schwitzko, did everything from be the head of the spiritual leader to the teaching Hebrew school. And he became kind of a father figure to me, and we became relatively close.
Now, may I ask, at that time, were you Orthodox? Or
No.
No,
We would probably be considered conservative.
conservative.
Although we had basically a kosher home, but we weren't Orthodox.
Did you speak Yiddish?
I learned Yiddish and German as a child.
I'm so jealous. I'm so
Well,
jealous.
they shouldn't be jealous because both of the languages were really street languages. Never learned to write, never learned to read. In fact, when I went to college, I told my advisor I had a choice to take a language, and I said, well, I'll take German,
Sure,
because I speak German.
sure.
And he said, okay, let's speak. And then he said, I don't think you should take German.
Oh, no.
He
It was
said,
that.
first of all, he said, what you know is everyday spoken mixed Yiddish and German.
It's a start.
It's what he said. It'll be much harder for you to try and unlearn what you think you know than to take a different language, which I took French. Almost didn't get through my freshman year of college. But yeah, I can converse in both languages, and as I say, my knowledge is limited, but in conversation, I'm fine in understanding some of the bad words, some of the good words.
No, we'll leave the bad words out. So your mother went to work.
My mother went to work, and she worked at the Boston store as a clerk. I think she probably earned 50 cents an hour or whatever they earned at the time. She worked all her life in sales. She was at the Boston store, and then she went to Chapman's.
Downtown?
Yeah, on East Wisconsin Avenue.
The big, beautiful Chapman?
Yeah, and then she went from better dresses in the Boston store to being selling furs at Chapman's, and had a good clientele.
Now, let me ask.
Yes.
There were no daycare in those days. Who took care of you?
My grandmother lived with
I
us.
see. So she.
That's where I learned my German,
I see.
my Yiddish.
I see.
Right after the war, we lived in a duplex on Highmont Boulevard. The duplex was sold. And unfortunately, the man who bought the duplex wanted to live in the lower
Uh-oh.
and could not find a place to live. My mother couldn't, no one after the war wanted to rent to a widow with 2 children.
Oh, my.
So we had to break up the family. And I had an aunt and uncle who was a cattle dealer in Thiensville.
A cattle dealer in Thiensville?
Right. They lived on the Donjas Bay Road. My uncle's father and grandfather homesteaded that area. They were there for over 100 years. The name was Levy, L-E-V-Y. And I went to live with an aunt who had 2 children, a son, Donald, who's basically my age, half a year older, and an older brother who had just gotten out of the Navy.
So you had to leave your mom?
My mother and brother found a place to live on 11th in Wisconsin in what now it was called the Tower Hotel, which is now a dorm right in the corner of 11th in Wisconsin, Marquette Dorm. It's a Tower Dorm. And they lived in one room with a pull-out bed. And he went to Washington High School and took the bus to Washington High School to graduate. He graduated in 47, the year of the snowstorm, December of 1947. Anyhow, I lived in the country for a year. I went to a one-room schoolhouse on the corner of 76th and Donjas Bay. There were 28 children in the school from first through, I think it probably was 6th grade.
Now, was that a fairly rural
It was a rural
atmosphere
school. Oh,
at that
yes.
time?
Very rural. Very rural.
Did you have an outhouse at that?
No. They had indoor plumbing.
Just wondering. Okay.
They did have an outhouse, but they didn't.
It wasn't used anymore?
No.
Okay. Just wondering.
No. And I learned some of the interesting things about farming
I
and
bet.
pitching hay and feeding cattle. And
And let me ask, were you the only Jewish student?
no, my cousins
Were also there?
were also there. And and across the street, they had cousins.
Okay.
So
there
there
was a
were,
representation.
actually, they owned a fair amount of property there.
I see.
And they had an 80-acre farm on one side of the road and 2 40s on the other side of the road.
Wow.
And there was a Suran family and a Haas family, and they were all related.
So there was a representation of Jewish students?
Oh, yeah, well, there must have been 6 at one time within the course of a number of years, right?
So you didn't feel all alone?
No, not at all. And I used to, interestingly enough, on weekends, many weekends, I would take the interurban, which ran on the corner of, it would have been 51st and Donjas Bay where it stopped, which is now, this is Kelly's Clubhouse, or,
I'm not real familiar.
and now it's not called that anymore. It's a restaurant into Milwaukee. And I would stay with my mother and brother on Saturday night and then go back on Sunday. And we had another person in this one room with a pull-out bed in the wall.
Goodness.
And I used to go to the Milwaukee Public Museum. It was a wonderful out for me. I'd walk from 11th in Wisconsin down to the museum on, which was what, on 9th or 8th, 10th.
And it was in the library at that time?
Well, half was library, half was
That
museum.
Right.
And I would spend hours walking through the museum, wandering, and that was a very big thrill for me. I guess I kind of lost myself in that atmosphere.
Was it then hard to go back to the rural setting?
No, I don't recall. My grandmother lived with us. My uncle was a very, very tough farmer, cattle dealer. I don't think I said very much eating there for a year at the table. He really wasn't, shall I say, as I was a young child, and he raised his voice a lot and spoke loudly and sometimes used some language which was country language. And I was somewhat fearful, so I kept my mouth shut for almost a year.
So you really had kind of a dual existence of your rural country life during the week.
Right.
And then the more urban city life on the weekends.
Right. Anyhow, my mother, during the course of that year when she wasn't working, attempted to find a place for us to live. And she finally found a place on Holton and Lloyd. Not a very nice neighborhood, even at that time. But it was a place, it was a corner house on an alley, a lower duplex. And her main interest was trying to get the family together.
Sure.
When she went to the school board and insisted that I go to Steuben Junior High School, and somehow or other, she swung it, and they made an arrangement, and I took the North Avenue, the North Avenue bus, which I caught on the corner of Holton and North, up to 51st and North, where Steuben Junior High School was, every day, and then took the bus back, while she continued to look for a place on the west side. And eventually she found an apartment on the corner of Sherman and Burleigh. There's 2 apartment buildings there, and we were in the second building. And the family was basically reunited together on the west side. And from there I went to Washington High School. I graduated. I went to Washington from 1950, 54, graduated in 56. I was a classmate of Bud Selig and Herb Cole. That was a good year. We had a great, good class. When you graduated from Washington High School in those years, you didn't have to take college entrance exams. You could go to any school in the country and be admitted. That was, especially if you took the college preparatory courses. And so that was very interesting.
I must back up just a minute.
Uh-huh.
Did you attend service on the High Holy Day, or what was the Jewish component of your life?
Well, I was bar mitzvah while we lived on High Mount Boulevard. I was became a surrogate minyan person. Every time they were short, I'd get the call. Come over, we need you for a minyan. We need you for a minyan. So I spent a lot of time running from after I got home from school for a 5 or 6 o'clock minyan at Temple and on 48th and Lloyd. The shamus, his name was Stillerman, and he used to call frequently.
Did you enjoy that?
Sure. I mean, it was
Hamish.
It was fine. I really wasn't an overly religious individual.
But it certainly had
But
its
I
place.
certainly had good Jewish feelings.
So
I was active in temple functions and BBYO. I was president of a high school fraternity, which was kind of, at the time, there was a competition between BBYO for Jewish youths and fraternities and sororities. One became a social outlet, one became an athletic outlet, really. And
Which
well, most of the fraternities and sororities were social outlets, and we all belonged to BBYO to be in the football and basketball. And I was I was president of our BBYO chapter and president of our fraternity, and we competed against each other. And I remember being called into the ACA office and asked if there was any way I could bring the fraternity boys into BBYO.
Did you?
And we did, yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah, and I ended up on the board of BBYO for many years.
Wonderful. Then I must ask this. Did you experience any anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I did when I was in grade school. I remember a kid chasing me home frequently, calling me a dirty Jew.
Really?
And, and
In grade school?
in grade school.
What about later on? Not so much? I
Not
hope.
much, no. Not much, really. No, Washington High School was pretty Jewish.
I was gonna
You know,
say-
when you say experience anti-Semitism, I have the honor of being a classmate of Matthias Kale. Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, but
Sorry.
this is at Washington High School. And I say the honor in a negative manner because Matthias Kale became the head of the American Nazi Party.
Oh, lovely.
And,
Oh, my.
he took over from George Lincoln Rockwell. And this was a very quiet young man who walked around with a guitar all day.
Oh, my.
And you would never have known that he was anti-Semitic. He was very, very active, well, probably in the years that I was in college
But at
in
that
Washington,
time,
D.C. Wouldn't have known it.
wow,
Wouldn't have
it's
known
always
it.
the quiet
No,
ones,
that's
isn't it?
right. That's right.
Well,
And it was at that time that while I was in high school, that of course Israel was becoming a state and things were happening, and I was very active in Habonim, which was a Zionist youth organization.
So certainly this was a big component in your life.
Yeah, Judaism was a big component in my
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
and I was basically probably as involved as anyone was at the time. Raised money for, if we could, for Israel, did things that.
And so your friends were of like-minded.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes,
That's the way things were.
very much so.
Okay.
It was pretty, clannish, groupish, or whatever. You had a group of people you traveled with socially, and
You only dated Jewish girls, I bet.
was that a positive statement?
No, I mean, things were different.
Basically, yes.
But
yes.
you had non-Jewish friends, certainly.
Of course,
Yes,
many,
okay.
many.
Just trying to-
Many. I was active in athletics for a while, and as I recollect, my working experience started at the age of 10. I had an uncle. Well, it wasn't an uncle. It was my grandmother's brother. Was a fruit peddler. He had a horse and wagon. And at 10, I used to go with him on the horse, drive the horse,
Oh,
up and down the Lower East Side. They lived off of 3rd Street. They were on 4th and Center. They had behind their house, they had a garage where they kept the horse and the wagon. And we used to go to Commission Row with the horse and wagon
early in the morning.
and
Yes.
then go on the route. And Tuesdays you'd be here, and Wednesdays you'd be, and I would drive the horse. The horse's name was David.
Naturally. That's
And I used to holler, "Go, David!" and fresh Frucht. And the people from the upstairs windows used to shout and come down, and it was a peddler's wagon. It was really an education for me. It was a wonderful education for me.
I'm charmed beyond words. I can't, that's so beautiful. I just have to share. Oh my
That-
gosh.
Did that for probably 2 summers. And then when I was in junior high school, my mother had a cousin who had come over in 1939 from Vienna. They were able to get out. As I haven't spoken about my mother's family at all, they had a bakery on 47th and North Avenue, Hechts, H-E-C-H-T-S, Vienna Bakery. Very, very fine bakery, and I learned to be a baker.
No.
And I made every one of the doughs, and I made Blätterteig, and I made Kuchen, and I made strudel, and I made, you name it, fancy cakes and cookies and the whole
When
thing.
we're done with the interview, can we talk about it?
And I worked there through junior high school. And
Did they pay you, or were you
oh,
just
sure,
helping out? Okay.
absolutely. I don't know, maybe I got 15 cents an hour.
Sure.
Oh, it was a big deal, of which part went to the household.
Certainly.
Whatever you made, you had to help out to live with. And as I say, I did that through junior high school and high school.
So business was good at the Vienna
It was a
bakery?
wonderful bakery. They supplied
bet.
Schuster's with all their Christmas cookies, Gimbals. They supplied pastries to the University Club and all the fancy clubs in the city of Milwaukee.
Right.
And everything was it was kosher also. It was kosher. They made no bread. They used to get the bread from Miller's, just to carry bread. But
I can only.
and they supplied a lot of the delis, like Wiesner's Deli on the east side used to come and pick up galachin and cakes and things like that
Do
they
you
served.
miss those today?
Well, do I miss those foods?
Yes.
That's, you speak of foods. When I grew up, and my grandmother, who had lived with us all my developing years, we had foods which you just took for granted. You never questioned what you ate. But I find out years later, I went to a restaurant and they said, we ate an item called palachinkin. Does that mean anything? It's a crepe.
Okay.
But it was a rolled up dough with nuts and sugar and whatever, and that became a delicacy when you went out to eat. Well, I ate that every other day. We ate, you know, chicken and dumplings, and then you grew up with certain smells in your household. You had, what did you call gribnitz? Do you know what that is? That's when they cut up the chicken, pieces of skin of the chicken, and they render it in fat and onions and stuff, and they let it sit on the stove. And you talk about cholesterol. You lived on cholesterol. You cooked with schmaltz.
Those were the days.
The foods that strudels and things that were everyday eating. Today, delicacies. Never gave it a second thought.
You were very lucky. That's all.
But we were poor people. And my grandmother would go to the store, and she'd go, and where are you going? She said, I'm going, must go for 50 foot butter. She'd never buy a pound of butter. She'd buy a stick. So she'd go and some eggs, and she'd come home and she'd make a meal. I remember as a kid going to a butcher store shop and getting calf's liver, because they would throw it away.
Oh, no.
Calf's liver was something
They didn't use?
or going to Guten's or someplace like that and getting what they call the schlung off of the tongue. That's the back part of the tongue where the bones are. Then they threw that away too. It was delicious. I mean, what did I know? I knew from nothing. And so, you made meals. You'd make a dish of noodles, and that was a meal. You'd make what you call rice mit Zimt. They'd cook rice in a double boiler, and you'd add cinnamon and sugar on top, and that would be a meal.
Sounds good to me, my friend.
Yeah,
Sounds great.
it was wonderful.
No one worried from
So-
cholesterol.
No,
Those were
and they
the
lived
days.
to their 80s,
Right. Those were the
late 80s.
I think we're doing something wrong.
So, I thought I had a wonderful upbringing.
It sounds like it.
So
So you were
I,
well cared for and happy and had a
I
few
guess I
problems.
didn't know any different. What I didn't have, I didn't know any
Can't miss
different.
what you don't have.
It
And
didn't make any difference
And
to
you
me.
had some father figures, Rabbi Switchko, and your
Yeah,
uncle.
and I had an uncle who, as I say, was a piece goods buyer at Schuster's, and he would go to New York frequently on buying trips and always bring me a toy or something like that. So,
Did you get along with your brother all right?
sure. My brother was always schlepped me around. We were both in Boy Scouts, and he was older, but I was their bandit,
What is his name, please?
Melvin. And
And of course, you honored your mother greatly.
my mother, as I say, worked all her life. When we opened a farm, I'm a pharmacist by profession. Her last working years was for us in our pharmacy, which was her biggest thrill. She was our cosmetician, so
Wow.
that was interesting.
Well, let us jump back then. You attended Washington High School.
I attended Washington High School, graduated in '56, went to, which is interesting thing is that my mother's saw to it that both my brother and I went to college. Somehow or other, we went to college.
Yes, yes.
And although we both worked in college,
Where
her
did
big thing was you go to school, you get an education, and you'll
You'll be all right.
be all right.
Did you go to Madison? Or?
I started out at UWM for 2 years because it was cheaper. In fact, I think my first year was still State Teachers College. I took pre-pharmacy here in Milwaukee. I had classes, they were barracks on 6th and Kilburn when you enter towards the freeway, where we had chemistry labs, and that's all knocked down today.
That's where some of the classes were?
Yeah. That was after, that was in the late 50s. Then we went to Madison and was graduated in '56. I was a member of AEPI fraternity.
Could you say that name once more, please?
Alpha Epsilon Pi.
Thank you. Was
I
that-
didn't make any honorary professional, any honorary academic societies.
Was that fraternity largely Jewish?
Oh, it was all Jewish.
All Jewish.
It was all Jewish. And I worked at the Pie Lamb House, which was also a Jewish fraternity. I had a meal job there. And
Making sandwiches? Or?
serving,
Oh,
serving.
So that's how you earned a little money?
I ate there, so I didn't have to eat in my own fraternity house.
Okay, so
That covered my food expenses.
Sure.
Plus, I had a job in a bacteriology lab washing Petri dishes. And I worked downtown. My last few years in high school in Milwaukee, I worked for J.C. Penney's downtown. I was in the men's clothing department. And I worked on a commission, which was unusual for a high school kid to work on commission. And I was there through high school, and I was relatively successful. I made a lot of money for a kid, because I got a commission. And the man who ran the department, his name was Eric Jacobson, who was a Jewish refugee, and I worked for him. And his son Tom is an attorney here in Milwaukee.
Sure.
And then he's got a brother who's a dentist here. Anyhow, the manager of the store's name was Mr. Doherty, and he liked me for some reason or other, and offered me a position of going to a training school for management at Penny's. Now, I was a high school kid.
Oh, my.
And I said, well, that's really wonderful of you, but I think I'm going on to college. And he said, well, when you go to Madison, I'll get you a job on the square at the Penny store.
Oh, how nice.
Which he did. So I had 3 jobs while I went to Madison.
Did you enjoy your years at Madison?
I enjoyed my years at Madison. There's a lot of things I couldn't participate in, but because I was working and other than that, yes, I enjoyed it. And, it was a good experience, wonderful experience.
And then you finished there and did
Finished school. I was commissioned in the United States Army when I graduated as a second lieutenant, and I went to Texas and was in the service in Texas, and they had an overabundance of second lieutenants, and my job in the Army was to teach doctors how to set up field evacuation hospitals, which is a MASH hospital, which everybody who's watched MASH knows what that is. And that's what I did in the service. I got out as a second lieutenant, went to a reserve unit here in Milwaukee, and was in the reserve for a few years, and then resigned my commission because we went into business. So.
And so going into business, you started, what, your own pharmacy?
We started our own pharmacy. My brother's a pharmacist, graduated a few years prior to me. And
what was the name of the business?
Bradley Village Pharmacy.
Oh, sure.
On the corner of 43rd and Bradley Road in Brown Deer. Opened in 1958. And we were there for 34 years.
Oh, my. You and your brother.
Uh-huh. My mother and my brother, and my brother passed away in 1964.
She must have been so thrilled.
That was wonderful.
The two of you.
Yeah, there she was thrilled.
Professional man.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know.
That
and
was a big thing.
of course, it is a big thing.
Well, we were there, very active in the community. We were there when Brown Deer was nothing, and Bradley Road was like the Burma Road. There was unpaved road. There was nothing on Brown Deer Road at all. There was an airport on Brown Deer Road.
Pretty rural.
It was very rural. Northridge didn't exist. There was a chicken farm, a turkey farm on 76 just south of Bradley Road.
So did your customers drive?
Well, we were at the beginning. My brother had done a lot of research. He was, thank God for him. He had checked with the telephone company and the electric company prior to us opening our store, finding out what their future plan was as far as how many phones are going to be in the area and what's going to be the electric company. And so we were really there building when the community built up. When we moved out there, it wasn't even a police department. We were patrolled by the sheriff's department.
Wow.
Brown Deer High School didn't exist. It was Granville High School.
Oh my gosh.
So we became a necessity for the community. And it was a nice little shopping center at the time. The first Red Owl store in Wisconsin opened there, at least in the Milwaukee area. And there was a Woolworth and a big shoe store and a hardware store. And a few years later, across the street, Kohl's opened up, also with the pharmacy. But we became pioneers in the area.
Indeed.
And people would come in and say, "Oh, I'm so happy you're here. I don't have to go into town to Villard Avenue." That was the closest pharmacy. So that we were relatively lucky and successful from the day we opened our doors.
Wonderful. Awesome.
And say we were there for 34 years, and it went through 3 generations of families, and knew everyone by name. And the kids would come back when they grew up with their kids. And I still go, wherever I go, I run into people, and say, "Oh, you were our pharmacist," or "You were this," or "You were that." So it was a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful, and we were very active in the community. We were on the Brown Deer Auxiliary Police Department. We were charter members of the Kiwanis, of the JCs. I started the high school homecoming parade for the area. For Brown Deer High School, I used to award prizes at halftime, give trophies to the Queen and her court, give cash prizes for floats, and the parades would start in our lot in front of our store. So it was, we were community.
How many children did you have? And you got married and had children? Or?
I got married. I met my wife. I always say I met my wife in bed.
Stop the film.
My wife had graduated from the University of Wisconsin as a teacher, music teacher, and somehow or other she developed mono, and instead of taking a contract in Madison where she was supposed to be taking a contract, she came home and spent 3-4 months in bed. At the time, that's how they treated mono. And I had a dear friend who said, "Would you like to meet a young lady?" And I said, "What? She's sick, but she's a very nice girl." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to meet some sick broad. I don't need that. I got a lot of ladies. I don't need to meet another one." Anyhow, I decided I would meet her. So we went over to her house, and she was sick. She was in bed, and she got up. But I spent most of the evening talking to her mother, playing Jewish geography with her, and
It's a good way to start a relationship.
told my future wife, "Well, when you're well, why don't you come and visit me?" And somehow or other, she got well and came over and stopped out late at night when I was closing, and we went out for a cup of coffee. And
have children? Did you have children?
and we have 2 children. I have a son and a daughter. My son is an attorney.
Here in town? Or?
He is now. He's with Michael Best and Friedrich. And my daughter is in Eagle, Colorado.
What is your son's name, please?
Michael
Altman?
Michael Altman. He was married to 4 years. Let's see. Michael was married 6 years ago, and to Carrie Greenberg. That's Marty and Bev Greenberg's daughter. And he worked for a large law firm in Chicago for 4 years, 5 years, and then came back to Milwaukee.
And your daughter?
And my daughter is single. She's in Eagle, Colorado now. She teaches 7th grade, graduated from the University of Wisconsin.
Teaching 7th grade is hard. What is her name, please?
Marjorie. And she's a real outdoors girl. She's a skier and a snowboarder and a mountain climber and a fly fisher lady.
Good grief. Bravo. Do they have a sense of Jewish identity as you
My
do?
son has a very good sense of Jewish identity. My daughter, not so much. My daughter, not so much. Well, she knows where she came from, but she's not particularly involved.
And grandchildren?
I have one grandson, just a little over 2,
Oh, congrats.
gorgeous young boy.
Oh,
name-
what's his name? Let's get it on the
His name is Jack Adam. I always call him Jack Daniels.
Stop the film.
Jack Adam, he's a gorgeous blue-eyed boy.
Of course.
And no, I mean, he is a
I know
gorgeous
he is.
blue-eyed
I know he
boy.
is. And he's here, right?
And he's
So-
here. They live here in Mequon.
Wonderful.
And we're thrilled to have them home with us.
I think he has a wonderful grandpa. He's in good shape.
Calls me Papa.
Beautiful. And he's 2.
Yeah, he's a
Lots
little
of
over
fun.
2, just starting
Lots of fun ahead.
to show his personality and be a real mensch.
So your children attended Sunday school, or,
My children attended Beth Israel. I was a member of 2 congregations for many, many years. I was a member of Beth El and Beth Israel, and I stayed at Beth El until Rabbi Schwitzko retired. And then I always had a feeling of obligation to.
certainly.
And he used to come out to my pharmacy on a regular basis and buy his Webster Fancy Tail cigars. He always said, "How are the boys? How are the boys today?" I thought he was a super person. There were some people who thought differently, but as far as I was concerned, he was wonderful.
Certainly. And then you also belong to Beth Israel.
I belonged to Beth Israel. We moved to Glendale, and partially out of convenience, I suppose, we became active in Beth Israel. And I was on the board at Beth Israel and on the school board at Beth Israel, and my children were both bar mitzvah at Beth Israel, and Michael went to high school in Israel for summer, and both have been to Israel a number of times.
So you have had a good balance between secular community life and Jewish community life.
I think so, yeah.
A healthy balance.
I personally have been active in the Jewish community for many, many years. I was head of bond drives on and off. I've been division chairman for Jewish Federation on and off for years. I've been in fundraising for 35 years.
Oh, my goodness.
So and I know the Jewish community fairly well.
I would say. Is it your perception that these are very difficult times, harder than in terms of world perception of Jewry?
Well, things have changed. Everything has changed. And at the time when Israel became a state, and then probably into proceeding through 67, the world looked at Jews and their survivors and the community as somewhat more positive than perhaps they looked at it today. Young people were involved great deal more than they are today. Young people today, Israel's taken for granted. It's there. It's ancient history, unfortunately, to many of them. You don't have the commitment, obviously, that we had.
During
You
the
don't
40
have the
years.
relationships of what went on in Europe, personal relationships. I never spoke about my mother's family.
Please feel free.
My mother's family came to the United States, I think in 1902. That was from Czechoslovakia. It was a town called Trenčín-Komštat. We don't know where that was. It changed with every war.
Sure.
Once it could have been Poland at one time. It could have been Czechoslovakia. It could have been Slovakia. It changed.
Sure.
My mother's grandfather, Anshul Haas, had 16 children. How do you keep track of all those?
That's a toughie, especially during
16
those times.
children,
Yes.
right. Anyhow, my grandmother came to this country, as I said 1900, did I say 1902?
1902.
You know, I have, excuse me
1902.
just a
That's
second
right.
here because I want to get this right. We're running out of time.
No, we're fine, we're fine.
Oh, we got it here, Ann Schulhaas. One of 16 children, Bernard, Marie, Jenny, Rose, Jacob, Moritz, Max, Lenny, Fanny, Reggie, Anna, the lot, whatever.
They're a village unto
There's
themselves.
just, yeah. And they came to Milwaukee, and I don't know why they came to Milwaukee, because I know why my father's side came to Milwaukee. They came to Milwaukee because she had a brother here. The brother who I worked for peddling fruit. He was here in Milwaukee. So I think he sponsored them to come here. I don't even know if you needed us. No. Just my grandmother.
Okay.
And her husband was a peddler. He sold brooms and books door to door. And I remember my grandmother saying, people used to say, I don't want no books. We don't want no books. He never made a living, evidently. So she worked in the brewery, washed bottles. And she was basically a housewife. She had 3 natural children, and my grandfather had a stepson. She had a stepson also who was here in Milwaukee with them. And worked very hard all her life. But again, she became the almost, my mother worked all day. She became the mother figure to me at home because she was at home. She had most of her family was killed in the war. Of the 16 children and their children's children, the only ones who survived was a brother who went to, after the war, he lived in a barn, wherever, was hidden for 3 years during the war.
World War II.
World War II I'm talking about, and went to Israel. I have cousins in Israel who we visit, who come here and we go there. The rest of the family, and I'm talking about relatively 14 adult people with their children's children, all perished in the war. So that side of the family, there's not a lot of history because we don't know what happened or what went on in there. So my grandmother passed away in 1963 at 86, I think she
Wow.
was, 86, 88.
I know this question is going to be one of those ones you did.
Ask me questions.
I know what you'll say, and I would agree. Number, the same.
You know,
All right, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way.
Okay.
What would be your fondest wish or your advice to the Jewish community leaders of Milwaukee today? You know, I mean, you've seen a lot, Al. You've seen it all.
Well, you know, the Jewish community of Milwaukee is shrinking. Or it isn't shrinking, but it's being, we probably had the same 25,000, had about 20 to 25,000 Jews in Milwaukee since the 50s. And it's changed a lot. Right now, probably a third of the community are Russians. Speaking of the Russians, we were very active in Russian resettlement. My wife and we sponsored one of the first families to come to Milwaukee. And I just have to bring this up because my wife is a musician.
Yes.
Very active in both Jewish music and was president of the Wisconsin Conservatory of Music until last year. The family we sponsored, called the Kramens, I don't know if that means anything to you, but I remember picking them up at the airport. There was a husband and wife and a mama and a grandma. And we picked them up at the airport and took them to the hotel where they were staying and helped them find an apartment. And I remember the first time I took them to a food store. And they walked at a major, like a Kohl's, and they walked in and walked around. And their eyes got as big as saucers. And they, first of all, they didn't think anything was real. And then they said, well, do we buy, where are the lines? And do we buy milk and meat at the same day? Or vegetables? For instance, in Russia, one day you could buy meat. And 3 days later, maybe you could buy bread and dairy products or whatever. They were wonderful people. And we were instrumental in helping them get jobs here in the city. And because they were musicians, Israel played the organ at Emmanuel for Sabbath, and they both taught music. And he went on to get a PhD in Michigan, I believe.
So,
And we are the godparents of their son, who is now graduating college this year. They live in Pittsburgh now, but we speak to them fairly regularly.
isn't that it's a treasure
So
of a relationship.
it's
So a third of the community is
I think
Russian,
pretty close.
roughly.
Yeah, and the problem is to get the young people to stay or come back. That's a problem within our community today. Some of them are realizing that this is a wonderful area to raise children. Hope, like my son, can move back to Milwaukee, and many of them are doing that. I see the Milwaukee community continuing, prospering. However, I'm not sure if it's flourishing. There's a difference between being here. We need to cultivate the young people into their Jewishness. They're bored with it. Some of them realize who they are and what they are, but there are many.
How do we do that? Through education?
Well, how do we do that?
I mean,
That's a good
big
question.
but education.
Through education, certainly they have to have the education. There's no question about that. But they also have to have the stimulus after that when they leave for college to want to continue to be involved, both through the synagogues and the community at large. And I really don't have answers on how
That's a
to
very
do that.
complex
Unfortunately, there are smarter people than I who don't have the answers for that. But I think that we will continue to survive in this community and flourish. And being Jewish is something to be proud of, not to, hey, we got 4,000 years of history going for us. Call it 5, 4, whatever it is. And we're very special in our own way. And although we don't have this closeness that young people had when I was young, because Sunday was family day. Everybody came to the house, whoever there was. They met somewhere. If it was at Lake Park in the summertime or at people's homes, it was more than just having Rosh Hashanah and breaking the fast. People were close. They were closer. And because, of course, they lived within a neighborhood. We all grew up, our parents all grew up somewhere south of North Avenue to Walnut Street, west to 20th and Center, and east to probably 1st Street or 5th Street.
That enclave.
That was a Jewish community. Walnut Street was a Jewish street. I remember as a child going to the Shoichet. Somewhere off of Walnut Street, going down the wooden steps that went into the basement, not the cement steps that went into the basement. And I used to see them kill the chickens and have these big boiling pot. It was amazing.
Were the holidays also a special time?
Holidays were special for a young person like me when I was young. It was a place to march from one temple to the other temple to the other temple. And I remember my grandmother went to the Ungar for the Hungarian temple, somewhere south of North Avenue on 8th, 9th, or 10th. I don't know exactly where it was. And I remember a guy walking around with a long stick and a feather on the end. And when the people fell asleep, he'd reach into the aisle and he'd tickle them. Now that's a memory.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
So, and as young people, we would walk from one synagogue to the next synagogue, and our last synagogue would be the old Beth Israel on Titonia, just north of North Avenue. The very big synagogue. It was gorgeous. And
So
But-
those were certainly identity building and community strengthening.
absolutely,
practices that we
we
no
all
longer
we
have.
all clung to and were part of
that-
our ethnic backgrounds. Even if we weren't religious, we were strong ethnic Jews. This was important. This was very, very important.
Did you frequent the Jewish centers when they
I
were?
frequented the center when it was on Holton Street, and I played basketball, and Larry Lederman was the honcho at the time over there. And I frequented the center and went to functions there, and it was a wonderful outlet. I played handball and racquetball.
So maybe what we're needing is that, it's a complex question, but how do we get the feeling of going from synagogue to synagogue and being
Well, you
part of
don't
that
anymore.
community, right?
You don't because you can't.
Right.
First of all, we walked. Everybody walked. Nobody walks anymore.
What's
You get
that?
into your car and drive a
Heard
half a
it.
block. You won't walk. I walked to high school. I walked a mile and a half to high school back and forth every day. Today that would be impossible. We don't need buses to take somebody from a half a mile away to school. I mean, this is silly.
So it's your hope that that sense of community, that the education of the young people, certainly the
I think you
leadership-
have to expose your children to as much Jewishness as you can, to expose them early, and to keep them aware of what they are, who they are, and where they came from, and their backgrounds, and their history, and let them know that. Because if we don't do that, we're going to lose ourselves, and we're going to lose our people. So let's keep them aware of where they are, where they came from.
I knew I'd get emotional. I told them I would. You have had an amazing life, Mr. Altman. You've seen so much from rural Thiensville to the development, really, of the whole Jewish community here in Milwaukee
Well,
over these 70 years.